I will start. I'll go live.
Okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I welcome you all to today's live session. I am Ankita Srinivas, and I am a proud member of Avial family, where we strive for the betterment of the open source community by helping great open source projects in their growth and monetization. Our community at Avial has a large number of interesting folks from the open source society, ranging from maintainers, developers, creators, writers, bloggers, and many more. And in today's session, we have Hillary joining us, who has been associated with Avial for quite some time now. And he officially began his developer's journey back in 2018 and has been contributing to open source ever since. With an upper hand in Python, Django, and complex AI systems, Hillary has been an active contributor to FreeCodeCamp, React, and Doxy communities. So, without further ado, Hillary, over to you. You can start.
Okay, thank you, Ankita. Hello, everyone. I'm Hillary Nyaykundi, and I'll be hosting you in today's event, which is explore on the front-end documentation best practices using Doxy and React. So I'm going to share my screen so that I can begin. And if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A section, and I'll be more than happy to answer them as I move on. So on today's session, we'll be talking about the do's and don'ts of front-end documentation. And as I introduced myself earlier, I am Hillary Nyaykundi. I prefer to call myself a growing developer because I believe that every day is a learning day, and in the tech industry or in the tech community, you never stop learning. So that's why I've always preferred to refer myself as a growing developer. I am passionate about technology and open source at large, and I am a lover of Python programming language and the Django framework. That's where I major. I am also a tech writer and a blog, currently writing articles for FreeCodeCamp and doing my personal blog on dev.to and Hashnode. And I also do host a podcast known as Let's Talk Developer, where I get to interview developers from around the globe so that they get to share their journey and hopefully inspire the upcoming developers by sharing tips on how to get started so that they too can reach a level where they have reached. And you can also reach to me via Twitter. That's my Twitter handle there. So without wasting much time, let's get started with today's event. On today's, basically, we'll be talking about, first, we'll need to see the front-end overview. We'll get to understand what exactly is front-end. We'll get also to understand what documentation is all about, what needs to be done, the guidelines that needs to be followed when a person is writing a documentation. We'll also see the do's of documentation, what you as a developer should keep in mind, what you should follow whenever you are writing a documentation for your project. And we'll also get some extra tips that will enable us to write very perfect documentation for our projects. And we'll also take a look at some documentation softwares we have in the market today. And our main focus today will be specifically on the Doxy, because that's the one which we'll be talking more about. We'll see the main reasons why you should prefer Doxy over the other softwares we have. We'll also walk through the setup of Doxy, and finally, we'll end up the session by the don'ts that you should avoid while writing a documentation. So let's get started by first trying to understand what front-end development is. So I believe everybody, most developers as per se, almost every developer personally included in the list, at some point we have done some front-end development, that is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and even used the React framework to do our projects, because that's the journey most developers tend to begin with. So for front-end development, we can define front-end development as this is where developers get to build the visible parts of a website, and these are the things that you as a user interacts with whenever you visit a website. And in order for you to become a front-end developer, there's some skills which you need to have. That is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, in order for you to understand these, you need to learn them. And in learning them, you need to understand a few basic things about it. So, for example, when learning HTML, you'll have to understand that in a real example, we can define HTML as a skeleton or body because it gives the website its structure. Every site you visit today, it is built using HTML beneath it. And we also have CSS. CSS, you can think of CSS as the muscles of your body. Take your body, for instance. Now, in web development, CSS can be compared to the muscles of your body. CSS makes a site beautiful and interesting to look at. Just like your body, where the muscles and skin make you beautiful, CSS does the same for the websites. And on the other hand, JavaScript is like the brain of the operation that tells you everything that, in this case, JavaScript tells the website how to behave. In short, JavaScript enables you to add functionality to your website. Now, let's assume that you want to take the front-end developer path. There's some responsibilities that come in handy for you as a front-end developer. Just like any other role we have in the development industry, each developer role has some responsibilities that come in handy. So the responsibility of a front-end developer include like collaborating with designers and application developers to develop customized website which will be productive to the user or to the person who will be using them. Also develop sites that are a wide array of contents and ensure optimal utilization of web tools. Well, this can be used mainly by let's say when developing websites, by making good use and utilizing the resources which are available, like the front-end frameworks you have like React, making good use of those and utilizing them to make sure that your project is good. Also, you should, as a responsibility of a front-end developer, you should be able to build reusable code for future use. I'm sure not every developer enjoys writing code over and over again. So writing a code that you'll be able to reuse in the future or in some time will be really comes in handy for this kind of developer, because most of the designs you'll be building might be similar, and trying to write the code over and over again might not be a good idea. So for you, having that code to reuse it in future will be really advantageous for you. Another point is for you to ensure that the web designs are responsive and work well on all devices. Well, most of the community, most of the users of our products as websites, most of them tend to browse them from their mobile phones. So it's your responsibility as a front-end developer to make sure that the website you have built is accessible from any device that can be used to access it. Let's say, be it a desktop, be it a laptop, be it a mobile phone, be it a tablet, your website should be able and accessed from all the devices we have. That's what we mean by making sure that your website is responsive. Work with the creative teams to develop innovative solutions to cater for a wider audience. Well, let's take this, for instance, as a working in hand with designers like the UI UX designers to make sure that your website is eye-catchy to the audience. I'm sure not everybody will be very pleased if they visit a website and the website doesn't have any styling in it. I'm sure as a client or as a person trying to visit a website, if you visit a website that is not well styled, you will not even spend more than a minute on the site. So your work as a front-end developer is to make sure that you work closely with the team that is behind the UI UX design to make sure that your website has an appealing look. And finally, the last responsibility is to write a clear, detailed documentation to help explain to the users what your website is all about. So that's what we are going to talk here today. We are going to look exactly at how you'll be able to write a clear documentation that won't cause any problems for a user trying to navigate through your product. It will be easier for the user to understand what exactly your product is all about, and it will be good for both parties. You'll be able to get clients to use your product, and the user will be happy as they try to read along the documentation which you have provided. Moving forward, so we have seen what front-end development is. We have seen some of the skills that you are required as a developer to have in order to become a front-end developer. Now, we have seen the responsibilities that come in handy as a front-end developer. We are also, one of the responsibility we saw is that be able to write a clear documentation that will be well understood to the user who will be using your product. Now let's take a step higher and try to understand what exactly is documentation. What do we mean when we talk about documentation? Well, documentation can be defined as, sorry, documentation can be defined as a written text or illustration that accompanies computer software or is embedded in the source code. The documentation either explains how the software operates or how to use it, and may mean different things to people in different roles. So what exactly do I mean by this? So I'm sure most of us, we have purchased stuff online. We have purchased, maybe let's say, softwares like Windows. I'm sure when you purchase something, it usually comes with a manual that explains to you how to set up, maybe if it's a new computer, how to set up the new computer, how to connect everything and to from scratch and up to make it running. The same thing happens to the software documentation. When you're trying to write a documentation for your software, you'll have to make sure that you explain each thing step by step, so that it will be easier for the user who is using your product to understand how it perfectly operates. The same way, when you purchase a TV, it gives you a detailed explanation from how to power it on, how to mount it on the wall, and how to set up the channels and everything. The same thing, you should apply that when you are developing your project. So we have two types of documentation. We have the product documentation and the process documentation. Product documentation is the documentation that gives you the guidance on how a product is used and how you should be able to use it from setting it up to the moment it fully functions. And process documentation is the example that I've given, like, let's say, like mounting a TV. It gives you the process from unboxing it, what should be done, how everything should be connected together, how the wire should be connected, and till the moment where it gives you the instructions of you mounting it on the wall. So that's a good example of process documentation. It gives you a guidance on a step by step on everything that should be done from start to the end till you see that your product is fully functional. And when writing documentations, we have some guidelines which we should follow. For example, a documentation should be from the point of view of the reader. When you're writing a documentation, write the documentation from the point of the reader. What do I mean by this? Let's say I'm trying to write a documentation about a product that I'm trying to develop. Since from my end, I know exactly what the product does, how to set it up from start and everything. Now, when I'm trying to write the documentation, I will need to write the documentation assuming that I have no idea or clue about anything relating to the product. I will have to assume that the person purchasing the product has never come across it, and they will need to know how exactly it operates. That's what we mean by you should write it from a reader point of view. You'll have to assume that you know nothing about it. It's your first time trying to encounter it. How will you explain it to a person who has no prior knowledge to the product? That's what we mean by this point. There should be no repetition. So whenever you are writing your documentation, be sure you are clear. Don't repeat yourself. For example, when writing code, there's no need for you to go ahead and repeat. Let's say you have a code in the introduction part explaining how to set up, let's say, Doxy, for example. If you move ahead to the another part of your project, there's no need for you to repeat the code again. For example, you can use a reference like to set up Doxy in this reference to page so and so. It will give you a clear guidance of how to set up the product instead of you performing repetition over and over in your documentation. And the last guideline, your documentation should be always updated. When developing softwares, time to time we tend to update the softwares, add new features. Now, whenever we add new features, we should be able to ensure that the documentation we have out to the internet is up to date with all the details that we have added in, so that the viewers or the users who are trying to access it or read it are able to understand exactly what the documentation is all about, and they're up to date with all the new features that have been added in it. So if you have any question, please feel free to ask them in the Q&A. And if I'm moving fast, feel free also to reach out and I will slow down so that you don't miss a point. So what are the do's that you should follow when writing a documentation? What are the do's that you should keep in mind when you're trying to write a documentation for your product? Well, for example, for the first point, define the target audience, the tone, the style, and the technicality you will use. When writing a documentation for this instant, before you begin writing your documentation, it is highly advised that you define your target audience, the tone you will use, the style, and the technicality you will use. All this depends on the audience you will be targeting. Well, when writing a documentation, most of the products, we have different types of audience. We have the young, we have the old, all lie in different age groups. Now, depending on the target audience that you are targeting with your product, you should make sure that the tone and the language you use is able to favor that age group or that target audience per se, so that they won't be having any difficulties when they try to learn or when they try to follow along the documentation that you provided. Another point is you should understand the product that you are writing the documentation for. So most of the time, I tend to believe that if you are writing a documentation for a product, you must have interacted with it, you must have used it, you must have run it through different test levels so that you be sure that you are familiar with the product. In short, when writing a documentation, make sure the product that you're trying to write a documentation for is well understood to yourself, you have used it before, and so that it will be easier for you to explain to another person who has no prior knowledge to the product how to go along with it. So if you want to write a great documentation, the first step is for you to be sure you understand how the product functions. If you don't even know how something is supposed to work, you can't have much confidence that it's working correctly. Plus, it creates uncertainty amongst teams about the working of the project. So be sure that you have a clear understanding of how exactly the project you're trying to write the documentation for exactly functions. Point number 3, the structure that you'll be taking in order to write a good documentation. So the structure and markup that you'll be using when writing the documentation. Structure your documentation by task relevant to the user instead of providing reference documentation by describing each part of the user interface individually. Always describe what a product can do rather than its limitations. You can follow this. For example, to better explain this point, I'm sure we have all interacted with some ebooks online. Whenever we purchase an ebook, it always has a section that has the table of content part. This means that whoever wrote the book had a structure in mind. He had the introduction part. After the introduction, he had the acknowledgement part. After the acknowledgement, he had the table of contents, which further gives the details that are listed in the book. The same thing should happen whenever you are trying to write a documentation. After having the introduction part and all the other basic introduction to the product you are trying to write a documentation for, it is highly recommended that you have something in the structure of a table of content that will give quick reference to the user to a specific part if the user would like to quickly switch to that part. So be sure to follow us. Make sure you have a structure that will guide you whenever you are writing a documentation to avoid inconveniences to the user when they try to reach or when they try to reference a specific part of your documentation. Point number 4, make use of diagrams and graphic materials. So provide diagrams or other graphic materials to help understand and communicate the structure and design principles. So let's say you're trying to write a documentation, and in the documentation you'll need it has some execution or some output after running it. Be sure to include a sample output so that the user will be able to follow along. Let's say if the user is trying to, for example, install Doxy in their project, whenever, let's say, for example, in the documentation of Doxy, we have a sample diagram that shows us the message that is expected if Doxy successfully runs in our project. The same thing should be done in your documentation for your project. Try to include code snippets, diagrams, pictures of outputs that are expected if successfully the product or the program executes to the end. Try to give the user something to follow along in a manner that the user will be able to know that if I try to run this product and I don't see this window that has been displayed in the documentation, I will for sure have a problem with my installation process. So I have to go ahead and begin afresh till I get this particular graphic diagram that has been given here. So that's the importance of diagrams. They help guide the user what is expected of them if something successfully happens or if it doesn't successfully install or load for that instance. Another point is the language that you'll be using. So we all come from different parts of the world. We all come from different time zones. We speak different languages. And this does not mean that you need to translate your code into vernaculars. Write your documentation in English because English is the most commonly spoken language worldwide and it will work in everybody's favor. So writing your documentation in English will be a good practice. Don't write your documentation maybe, for example, in your local language because most people won't understand it and you're trying to reach a greater audience for your documentation. So be sure to use a widely spoken language so that people will be able to follow along easily. Definition of terms. So whenever you are writing a documentation, you will be tempted to use some terms that may not be familiar to the user. So be sure to spare a section of your documentation that will be able to explain the terms that you have used, all the acronyms that you have used in reference to your documentation. Sparing a section and maybe name it abbreviation or definition of terms in your documentation will come in handy to a person who has no idea what that term means, but will be able to refer to that section and will have the knowledge of exactly what that term means. And finally, add sample codes. So whenever you are writing a documentation, for example, in this case, when you are using Doxy, to write your documentation, be sure to include sample codes that a person or the customer trying to access it won't have the need to copy it or to write it from scratch. In this case, they will be able to go and copy the code and paste it in their maybe terminal or their working environment, and everything will be running smoothly. There's no need for the person to go ahead and begin writing the code all the way from scratch, and you have the ability to give them ease or reduce that process of them writing the code by providing sample codes that will be easily copied from your documentation to their terminal, for example. So those are some of the do's that you should keep in mind when writing a documentation, plus many other practices. Also make sure that your documentation is eye-catchy, because writing a documentation is like I will compare writing a documentation like writing an article. You'll always want your article to be eye-catchy and appealing to the person who is reading it, and the person also should be able to follow along. So the same principles that are applied when writing an article should be the same principles that will be followed when writing a documentation. Be simple, don't use complicated terms, and if you use complicated terms, be sure to explain them in the definition of terms section. Moving forward, more tips that will help you in writing a good documentation to your users. Define the purpose of your project documentation. What is the purpose of your project? Why are you writing the project? Why are you writing the documentation of your project? Are you trying to get a wide number of users to use your product? Are you trying to educate people about what exactly your product does, or you're trying to send awareness of your product? Have a purpose of writing a documentation before you begin. Remember to add technology used in the creation of the product. Well, we all code in different languages, we all use different technologies. So whenever you write a documentation, chances are that you'll have to include the technologies you have used. So for example, if I were to write a documentation for myself to other people, the technologies that I will most probably use in this case will be maybe Python or Django. I'll be sure to include that in the documentation so that a person will be able to easily understand that the kind of product that I'm trying to access or the kind of product that I am trying to use has been built using Python and Django, or has been built using Java and let's say any other framework that you're comfortable with, or has been built using PHP. So this comes in handy to the user. It will give them first-hand information and knowledge that the kind of project I'm trying to tackle now has been created using this kind of technology. Another point, you should also remember to document the unexpected events that may occur. So for example, when most of the time when you try to install, let's say, softwares from online, even though we follow the documentation, most of the documentation don't list the unexpected errors that might occur. So for example, in this case, I will give an example, the one that I've been trying to run of recent. As I was trying to install Docker, I was following the documentation along, but along the way, I couldn't be able to install it because I encountered some few errors here and there. But through Googling, I was able to fix that. Now, if the Docker documentation could have explained to me that during the installation, you might be able to incur these and these challenges, or you might be able to face this and this, and this is how you should fix it, that will really have helped me and will have saved me much time of going to the internet and trying to search for that. So whenever you write a documentation, be sure to explain, for example, if when running your documentation, or when running your software on, let's say, Windows, you might incur these challenges, and this is how you are expected to fix them. When running your software in Mac or Linux operating system, these are the challenges that you might occur, and this is how you should fix them. So be sure to include that part in your documentation. It will really save time for the person trying to use your product and for the person trying to read along your documentation. And the last tip, remember to backup. Well, I'm sure that even though you might have published your documentation online, having a backup is really important thing, because you never know what might happen. Having a backup is a really important thing, and you should keep that in mind, not only for the documentation part, but also whenever you are developing your projects, whenever you are trying to create something new or to write something, be sure to have a backup just in case something happens. You never know what might happen. So be sure to always have a backup with you. So moving forward to the documentation softwares we have in the market today. So we have the likes of Storybook, we have the likes of Docs, we have Tooljet, we have Expo, we have Doxy, just to mention a few. Those are some of the documentations softwares we have in the market today. So out of all the listed documentation you can see here, our main focus today will be specifically on Doxy, because that's what we'll be talking about. So let's see why Doxy. Why should you consider Doxy over the other softwares we have in the market today? Well, one of the first reason you should consider to use Doxy over the other is that Doxy it's powered by Gatsby, and it's easily customizable, it's fast, and it's based on Mdx. It supports TypeScript, and it's SEO friendly, meaning it's SEO friendly and readable, meaning using it is really advantageous to you. So when writing a documentation, it is important for you as a project maintainer to know the kind of software that you'll be using. Docz is a very nice documentation generator because it enables interactive documentation for your React components in a very little effort. You wouldn't have to do much when using Docz because you'll have almost everything generated for you. All you need to do is follow along the guidance that has been given and do your part of writing a very detailed documentation, and the rest Docz will handle for you. Docz uses Mdx. By Mdx is the short form for Markdown with JSX, which brings the React component to the Markdown files from the prototypes and flow types of TypeScript types. It can generate property tables to document properly how to use your components. In addition, you can provide a coding playground, which is enabled when writing documentation using Docz for your components so that anyone can see them in action, modify the code and see the changes live, or copy the snippet to use somewhere else. So that's another advantage of Docz. It gives you a chance to use a coding playground in your documentation in such a manner that anybody who reads along the documentation is able to play along the code samples that you have given there, and the instance, and is able to see the results instantly on the documentation itself. The person won't have to copy the code, maybe, let's say, to his or her code editor in order to see the changes. The changes will be visible there immediately. Plus, it also gives you an opportunity for you to copy the code snippets and use them somewhere else. Let's say, for example, in your project or in your terminal if you are trying to install something using Docz. So that being said, why you should prefer Docz over the other softwares, let's move forward and see. Sorry, we should first see the setting up of Docz. So when setting up of Docz, uh, okay,
Uh,
so when
so, let,
setting up of Docz,
so let's take a small break before you set up. You can answer some of the questions in meantime.
okay, that will be a good idea.
So you want to take break and come and answer, or how do you want to do it?
Okay, I think I will take a break and come back and answer the questions that have been asked.
Okay. So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Catch you guys soon.
Okay.
Yeah, Hillary. Hey all, we are back. So let's start the session again. So we'll start with the question and answers. So Hillary will be answering some of the questions. Then we can go forward from the setup.
Okay, so good to see you guys back. So the first question we have here is how to make your web design more user friendly. Well, it depends with the kind of website that you're trying to build. So, but some of the major tips that you should consider when trying to create a website and that will enable you to make it user friendly. In this case, if you are creating a website that, let's say, will be used by a large group of people, in this case, it will be a good idea for you to listen to the views and what people have to say. It's good to take note of what your users or your customers have in mind regarding your website. Ask for ideas, maybe conduct some surveys if you are trying to create a website like an e-commerce website. Listen to what your users have to say and try to implement that. And another thing is ensure that your website is up to speed. Let's say when somebody tries to access your website, be sure that your website does not take much time to load. And the only way to ensure this is by making sure that you do not use large files in it. Let's say files like images, video, or something of that sort. It's always a good idea to compress them before uploading them to your website. This way, your website won't be slow. Another thing is provide information about your website. That's where most of the sites we have are, let's say, they have the about section. The about section gives detailed information about exactly what the website is all about. So by you providing extra information or detailed information about what your website is all about or what your company is all about in your website, that also will be a good idea. And another one is choose the colors you use in your website. Don't go ahead and mixing colors without keeping in mind. In short, follow your brand. Make sure that your brand has a specific color and implement the color in your web design, and don't mix a lot of colors. And the font you also use, make sure that the font you stick, let's say, to one or two fonts in your website. And another one is improve your site layout, and this can be done from the designing part. When before you begin designing your website or developing it, it's always a good idea, let's say, to have let's say something like a layout design. You can use a tool like Figma. Figma is a very good tool to create a layout, something, or to visualize. Figma will help you to visualize what exactly your website should look like. And after getting the clear picture of what your website should look like, then you should be able to go ahead and code it. And another thing for you to also ensure that you have a contact us page, as I mentioned earlier. An about us page is very important. Also, having a contact us page is very important. This way, the users will be have a way to reach you, have a way to contact you. And I think if you try to follow along those tips, you'll be good to go in creating a, let's say, a user-friendly website. Moving to the next question, any tips for the newbies to start their career in the front-end development? So if you want to start a career in the front-end development, it is always, first of all, a good idea. If you want to start a career, it means you have decided you want to be a front-end developer, meaning you'll have to learn. First of all, it's a good idea to learn the basics. In this case, we are talking about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript before advancing to learning more about the frameworks that will help you build the front-end projects. Another thing is that you should be able to make good use of the online resources we have to learn. We have companies offering boot camps online which have resources. We have roadmaps that guide you on the front-end development journey. So be sure to follow those paths and don't confuse yourself. online we have many resources that everybody will define front-end development in his or her own way. So be sure to stick first, learn the basics. After you have understood the basics, move on to the next level, trying to understand the more advancement knowledge that is needed in in CSS and JavaScript. And also do more projects. We have sites like Front End Mentor, which have challenges for front end developers. So after learning the basics and you feel that you're in a position you can handle a project, feel free to visit a site like frontendmentor.com. It has challenges from beginner level to advanced level, basically based on front end development, which after completion you will be awarded, I think, some badges and create a lot of projects. And you should start as early as now. That's the advice for the newbies. Understand the basics, use the online resources we have, do more projects, and begin and never stop practicing. As I said earlier, we live in a learning. Everything evolves in each day. So today we have something new that yesterday wasn't available. So be sure to be up to the trend and never miss out anything when it comes to the career that you have chosen to take. So I will go back to presenting my screen where we had left earlier. If you have any other question, please feel free to ask them. I will be able to answer them before the end of the session. So moving forward to sharing my screen, we had reached a point where we were setting up Doxy in our machine. So sorry to disappoint you, but I've been trying to run the setup of Doxy for the past few minutes in my machine, but it seems like I have some errors. But I'm going to show you, to walk you through the installation. It's an easy process to follow along. So I'm going to show you the installation process from the article that I had written earlier, and that article should be able to guide you on how to install it without encountering any challenges. So I'll have to stop this for the moment and share the article itself. So this is the article that, just a minute. So from this point here, installing Up Doxy, setting up Doxy into our machine. So the first step you need is for you to initialize using the npm command. So this is the command that initializes Doxy in your project. So by running this command, this is the output that you'll be expected to see in the terminal in this case. So as I said earlier, when writing a documentation, it is always a good idea to include graphics and code snippets. So as you can see, that is exactly what I'm following along in my documentation or in my article here. So we have the first step, initialize Doxy using this command. And after that, we need to install the Doxy package into our machine. And the command of installing the Doxy package into our project is this one here, npm install save Doxy. In this case, here might be the other name. It's not a must for it to be Doxy. It might be any other name that you're comfortable with, but the last part should be included. As you can also go ahead with the article itself and the commands since they are provided there. And this is the output that is expected for you when installing the Doxy package in your project. Now, after installing the Doxy package in your project, you may have to install React or React DOM as well. After that, be sure to add the 3 scripts in this file. So after installing the package and initializing Doxy in your project, be sure to add these 3 scripts we have here in your package.json file, which will be located in your source file. It will be in your source file directory named package.json. You can also go ahead and, I don't think yeah, you can go ahead and copy this if it won't be automatically installed in your machine. So as I mentioned earlier, Doxy uses Mdx format and allows you to easily integrate JSX inside your Markdown. So to initialize that, you need to run either of these two commands depending on the operating system you're in. So for me, since I was using Windows, this is the one that I had to run in my machine. And the third step is for you to create a Mdx file. The Mdx file is the one that will be used to the file that where you'll be the file that will be responsible for you writing your documentation. It will have everything that the user will be able to read from the documentation guide that will be provided online. So go ahead and create a file and give it an extension of .mdx. And in the file, the format is this one. You'll have to begin with this format in order for the file to reflect in the documentation itself in the browser. So be sure to follow this format here. And after creating the Mdx file, after writing everything you need regarding your documentation, be sure to save it and run this command again. The command will initialize and open a port that has your project documentation in it. Initially or generally, the project should open in port 3000, and if you follow along the code snippets given in the article, this is the expected output that we should have by the end of you running the commands that are given in the article. As I mentioned earlier, it's always a good idea to give expected output. So if you don't have this output by the end of running all the mentions command up here, be sure to check exactly if you followed them in the correct manner, so that to be sure you have everything set and running. So as I mentioned again, it's in the Mdx file that will be able to write our documentation, and it's going to display to us what will be visible to us. So for example, as you can see here, hello there, creating an awesome documentation using Doxy. The same thing is the one that is generated in the window after running the Doxy setup. So be sure to follow along, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out via the article in the comment section, and I will be willing to assist you. Again, I apologize for not showing you the live code. My machine ran into some problems while trying to do the same, so I really apologize on that. So hopefully you'll be able to do that exactly and have a fully running setup of Doxy in your project. And if you may encounter any problem, again, feel free to reach out. So let's move forward and see the don'ts that you might, actually not you might, the don'ts that you should avoid when writing a documentation for your project. So I'm going to switch back to my slides. The don'ts to avoid when writing a documentation for your project. Well, the first thing, don't promise anything. So when writing a project documentation, it's always a good idea not to promise the users anything in the future. When creating it's advised not to promise future features. At the moment, if you are not sure of anything, don't promise it. Only include the features that already exist in the product, or the ones that will be completed before the documentation is officially published. Don't promise anything if it's not working. But if you are able to add features and test on them and be sure that they are fully working, then you can go ahead and add them in the documentation and update it in your official documentation of your product. But whenever releasing a documentation for a ready product, don't promise any future product. Take, for example, let's say like the earliest product, the latest product that was launched, which was iPhone. We never knew anything about the iPhone, for example. Only they were able to share the information when they were sure that everything that they were working on was fully functional and was 100% guaranteed for the user to enjoy. So the same thing happens when you are trying to create a documentation. Don't promise anything unless you are sure that it's fully working, you have tested on it. Then you will be able to go ahead and add it in your documentation and relaunch it or update it online. As I said earlier, one of the things that you should consider when writing a documentation is always make sure that it's up to date. So whenever you add a new feature to your software or your product, be sure to go back to the documentation and update it so that it is reliable to the person, to the new user who is trying to use it. Another point is do not duplicate. If you have described several similar algorithms, design, APIs, etc., do not duplicate all of this over again. Have it described in one place and use reference in the other section. As I mentioned earlier, when trying to write a documentation, do not repeat yourself. Make sure that if it's a must for you to repeat a code, it's better for you to use a reference. Be sure to write that specific part of a code in one place, and if it's a must for you, even if there is a need for you to repeat it, use a reference. For example, like to see the setup of Doxy code, something of that sort, use the reference on figure this and this, or use the reference that is provided, or use the reference that will link a person to where the exact code is. Don't repeat yourself, don't duplicate code, don't duplicate APIs, don't duplicate images, don't do that. And again, the last option is unsupported features. Documenting on unsupported features should be excluded. Nobody is interested in the testing units you had to conduct before launching your product. But if it is necessary, be sure to explain the support status and give more details about the same. So, whenever we develop softwares, whenever we try to come up with new programs, we always have that testing period. And whenever we try to write a documentation, I'm pretty much sure you as the user won't be interested in knowing that the product failed these and these times, the product was not able to perform this and this. So be sure to exclude that part from your documentation and only include the relevant information that the reader will be willing to. Be sure to include relevant information that will be relevant to the user who is trying to use your product. Don't include unsupported features in your documentation. I'm pretty much sure the reader won't be. Most of the users who will be using your documentation might not have the knowledge that you have of programming or something of that sort. So you including the unsupported features that you might have encountered along the way to the documentation might really look bad to the person trying to use the documentation, because first, they will not understand what exactly is happening. They will not understand what the code exactly does, and you including that may even demoralize them from using your documentation along the process. So be sure to avoid these three main points. Don't duplicate anything. Don't promise any future updates if you're not sure of them, and don't include unsupported features like testing in your documentation. So that being said, hopefully the session was educative to you. Hopefully you have learned something new, and hopefully you'll from now on moving forward, you'll be able to use Doxy to write your documentation. Be sure to check out the Doxy documentation from their site. And that is it for this section. Feel free to reach out via the links you can see on the screen. That being said, let's get into writing better documentation from now moving forward, following the main points that have been covered in today's section. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you for such an interesting session on documentation, and thank you all for joining. So we can have a look at the poll and have some insights on that.
Sure.
And you can have leave a comment on those polls, Hillary.
Yeah, sure. I will definitely do that. So on the poll, we had which is better alternative to ViewPress for curating front-end documentation. So we have 50% of you went with Doxy, and 50%, actually 50%, 100% of you went with Doxy. So Doxy it is. What are the two main types of documentation? That it was, I think, in the second, third part of the presentation slide. So we had product documentation and process documentation. So those are the two main types of documentation we covered in the section today. True or false? Before you begin writing your documentation, it is highly advised you define your target audience. That's very true. You cannot begin writing your documentation if you do not know whom you're trying to target with the product you're trying to launch. So be sure to check on the target audience before writing the documentation. If you want to write great documentation, the first step is for you to be sure you understand how the product works. Exactly. If you want to write a documentation for a certain product, be sure that you have used the product, you understand exactly what the product does, how it functions, so that you'll be able to explain it to a person who have never come across the product, and whenever it will be easier for them to use the product following your explanation via the documentation. So that's true. If you want to write a great documentation, the first step is for you to understand how the product works. Provide diagrams or other graphic materials to help understand and communicate the structure and design principles. Also, that is very true. Whenever you're trying to write a documentation, it is highly recommended that you use graphics, material, and pictures or code snippets so that the person trying to follow along might know what is expected from them if a certain thing does not run as expected. So, following this from the article, you also saw that we try to follow along the do's for writing a documentation. We were able to provide code snippets. We are able to provide graphics of what is expected after running the code snippets. So, following by providing graphics material, that will be a good idea when writing a documentation. So be sure to follow these and every other thing that we have covered today to make sure that you write a good documentation that will be good practice for your users to read and follow along. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you all for joining and for your participation. So you can log on Do's and Don't by Hillary on the general chat. And the podcast on this session will be out on our YouTube channel if you have missed on anything. So let's meet again with another interesting session in upcoming days. Have a good night or good day based on your time zone. See you all.
See you, and be sure to read the article and understand everything that is required for you to write a good documentation.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Have a good night from your time zone or a good day depending where you are. Thank you, guys.